we've all been concerned throughout the election process about what the role of men may or may not be, not only in the election process, but in society as a whole. And it's been a bit of an eye opener for everyone. And so there's sort of two tracks to this conversation, I suppose. One is what's happening in education, and the other is what happens is happening in society. And I know they're obviously related and rightly so. As we reflect and wonder what's happening in society uh, between men and women, the the attributes and achievements of men or lack of them. One question that comes to mind is the education of boys. Are they being educated socially as well as academically? And I know you'll have some thoughts on that. I'm not including this. It's just kind of a between us before we
Sure,
start the question.
sure, sure.
So that's kind of on my mind. I don't know if it should be or not. But so let's just begin. What's happening with young men in America? What should we be concerned about regarding young men in America these days?
Yeah. So to be super clear up front about what is firmly within my wheelhouse to talk about as as a scholar and an advocate, that would be primarily on the academic struggles boys and men face. But increasingly in that conversation, broader issues about how we socialize boys and men are part of that. And then because of the recent election and even the lead up to the election, and certainly uh, the appeal of now President elect Trump to a fairly significant chunk of the young male and probably older male population. And by the way, not just white males. I mean, that was sort of always the particular emphasis, years ago with the whole white nationalism appeal of Trump and all of that. But clearly, from the election results, his appeal to men is broader than that. It's not situated solely within a particular, ethnic, racial group. Um, and so that calls into question what exactly, like you said, is going on there, and what should we therefore be concerned by? Um, so I'll try to tackle both. And if I start to veer off of where you want me to, just please jump in. But I'm going to give you sort of everything I've got. Part of the appeal of talking to someone like you and in this particular format is that I think we can get into things in more depth, and it's not going to be kind of glib responses or that kind of thing, which there's plenty of
Absolutely.
that already, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. That's
So
why we're here.
so let me start. I'll start from the very top, and then we'll work our way down. So it's been clear for some time, decades, in fact, that boys, adolescents, and men are struggling, you know, academically relative to girls and women. And as I said, that's my specific focus. And I think those academic struggles are both a symptom of some inequities within the educational system, starting from very early on, that I think are real. And I think the challenge sometimes is when folks like me point out these inequities, uh, the response sometimes is that it's a smoke screen. It's we're trying to change the focus away from all of the achievements women have made over these decades, and that this is, adjacent to these more extreme men's rights movements, and that, that maybe we've been dog whistling and that kind of thing. And I just want to make it clear that's not not only not my intent at all, but I think it also makes it hard to convince people that we have a real issue here. And one way that I have found that I can get traction on focusing these concerns of academic struggles and talking about what we can do about them is by also saying that when boys and men struggle academically, well, that is going to then also set off these other chain of events that go way beyond academic struggles. They go to lowered self-perceptions of their own self-worth, of their self-efficacy in this world, of their prospects for future employment. We know that, academic struggles are connected to, greater likelihood of running afoul of the law, less stability in family life. I mean, the list goes on. So there's the struggles are a symptom of something, but they also produce effects that I think we don't want, right, as a healthy functioning society. And in some ways, the conversation around these issues is finally kind of breaking through to a kind of public consciousness. Um, More folks like you are reaching out to folks like me to discuss these issues. Certainly, the election and the politics around that and the rise of Trump factors into that concern. Um, but I think, ironically, as well, the whole toxic masculinity conversation, which is a term that a lot of the folks on my side of things in our field really don't like, and I can explain why. But it certainly has generated more interest related to boys and men's places in this kind of shifting sociocultural space. And I think, you know, sometimes these things get very oversimplified, as is often the case when they enter a kind of public consciousness and so forth. But um, I don't, my concern is that we have to acknowledge that there are many ways of being a man, right? And a lot of that, a big chunk of that, is how we raise boys and men and how we socialize boys and men. Are there biological differences? Yes, there are. The brain science is pretty clear on that. But a lot of the issues that I think we're all concerned about clearly have to do with socialization, right? So there's that. And certainly one way to be a man, and I would say a healthy man, is to also have certain aspects of, traditional masculinity that are not self-destructive or abusive, right, to others. Um, I can name several. I mean, things like, loyalty, grace under pressure, bravery, a kind of stoicism that isn't just about repressing one's feelings. These are often identified as characteristics of masculinity, even in the research science, right? And there's a way to be a healthy male who is well integrated into society, who is respectful, who is caring, that isn't necessarily feminine. And the reason I'm pointing that out has to do with the appeal, I think, of young men to, President-elect Trump and the MAGA movement and all that. Because if we can't define aspects of masculinity that are not on the one extreme end, kind of cartoonish, hyper masculine forms that aren't good for anyone, but on the other end aren't also just completely feminized. If we can't do that, then we are sort of declaring that we are not interested in appealing or in trying to engage with a significant population of males, right?
Can you
And
unpack that a little bit
yeah,
more before we move on? Are you saying that there's a unrecognized solid majority center that don't fit either extreme?
I think increasingly so. I, I mean, this is somewhat anecdotal, but I've had so many conversations with people that are very much like me in terms of my socio-demographic characteristics, right? I'm an academic. Uh, I'm in some ways a prototypical um, left-leaning professor that you find everywhere in academia. Um, and a lot of folks like me feel that both ends of the political spectrum have sort of dug into these extreme positions on both sides that essentially forestall any kind of collective engagement. Um, and I think it's important to understand that the appeal of someone like Trump doesn't happen without a broader supporting context. And it's not just the fact that Trump kind of embodies a lot of these stereotypical traditional masculinity tropes of being aggressive, confident, unapologetically confrontational. That doesn't explain it all. Because if you look around the world at other cultures that also exhibit these forms of kind of machismo or masculinity, you can find plenty of examples of males voting for females in higher office. I'm thinking the recent election of the president of Mexico. I'm thinking in a more distant past, Israel, India, other places where certainly you can identify these traditional masculine tropes, but people seem to be willing to also vote for, a female candidate. I think it's more that in the US, it's coming at a time when what it means to be male in the sense of gender is under great scrutiny. It's in a state of flux, and boys and adolescents and young men are having to sort of figure out an identity while navigating these fundamental questions of their place in modern America. And listen, some are going to face that challenge and are willing to engage in self-reflection, willing to engage with their communities, willing to change if necessary towards healthier behaviors. And if at least, if not change, then at least argue their positions in good faith. But for others, and it's clear this is a significant chunk, the fear, frustration, and anger that they feel draws them to individuals that promote a certain kind of certainty and politics of confrontation because they feel displaced and they're angry about it and they're frustrated about it. And I think that's kind of where we're at and where we've been for a while now. And I want to be really careful here because I don't want to be misunderstood. And so, like I said, I'm a traditional, old school liberal Democrat. That's who I am. I don't hide that from anybody. I'm a child of immigrant parents, immigrant Greek parents, and I love this country. We were given opportunities here in America that I never would have had if my parents decided to stay in Greece, especially at the time. But there's also this kind of disingenuousness that I feel from the left, which is generally speaking who I interact with, on a lot of these issues of boys and masculinity. And now the left people on the left won't say this out loud usually, but it goes something like this. Masculinity is just bad. It's just inherently rotten. And boys have to change, and we have to change them from the ground up. And if that's the message you're broadcasting, and it's a message, by the way, that I think that the left would never proclaim as a solution for any other group facing the kind of stark inequities, for example, academically and mental health, that boys face and men face. If you were going to use those arguments to talk about equity gaps by race or income, you'd be shouted out of the room, right? But that does not
You
seem to
would
be
get
the
shouted
case.
at if you said black people have to change from the bottom up to be
Exactly. We
more
would
like
be
us.
exactly. And by the way, we went through that. We went through that period of time in America, right? Um, and where that was the message. The message was turn into us and you'll be fine, right? And by the way, on the flip side, I would never say, I have two sons, but if I had a daughter, my message to my daughter, if I was raising her, wouldn't be for you to be successful, you have to be more like a boy or a man. You know, it would be equally problematic. And so I think that's the context. And by the way, that's fertile ground for someone to come along and say, no, you don't have to change. The world has to change. Or we have to return to a time when you had more authority, more certainty in your place in the world, more self-worth, more respect, some reliable prospect of upward mobility. And, and we can't just say, no, you cannot want those things. So if someone's going to offer those things, even if
I'm
they
a
can't
little
deliver,
confused. When you use the word
yeah,
you, are you talking about leftists referring to males or
I'm talking about telling males that they can't want these better outcomes just because it feels transgressive to the current politics. Like we can't say to a male, well, you can't demand more self-respect because it's a zero-sum game. And if we give you more respect, we're somehow taking respect away from women, which is often the message that we give, that it's a zero-sum game. That greater success for one gender means less success for another, right? And if we can't offer a better deal, right? And by we, I mean the people on the left, to these two young men, working class men. I mean, that's been the new sort of, concern among Democrats, is that we're not appealing to working class men. Um, then, on the pragmatic end, we're just not going to win elections, at least not at the national level anymore. I mean, I think I'm not a political scientist by any means, but I've been consuming more than my fair share of political, news lately. And I think one of the things people have to kind of reckon with is that um, it's pretty clear that President-elect Trump broadened his base. He's not a political figure now that just has this kind of hyper loyal following that will never leave him, regardless of what he does. He's broadened the base. And that coalition, that broadened coalition, isn't going anywhere, at least not in the immediate future, based on what I'm seeing, right? So I think, how we interact, how we message, what we say to young men in particular is really important. It gets heard. I mean, I think there's no doubt that it's not just, and this is the other thing I hear from my friends and my wider circle, that, well, we just didn't explain ourselves correctly. You know, um, Vice President Harris just didn't explain herself correctly. And my argument, or maybe she didn't have the time to explain herself correctly. And my argument back is, well, I don't know if that's true. I think people heard what she had to say and then decided to vote accordingly.
That attitude that you described is a result of, I think, probably a failure to understand there is another point of view that has a big
Yeah,
following.
exactly. And that point of view isn't necessarily always sexist, misogynistic, and racist. Uh, are there elements like that? Of course, of course, of course, of course. But that to conclude that this many voters exhibit these antisocial characteristics, and that's why they're voting for Trump. Well, if that's true, then we're going into dark times. But I don't necessarily believe that's true. We may be going into dark times anyway, who knows? But I don't think necessarily it's because the very nature and consciousness of the American electorate has just fundamentally gone off the rails. I don't believe that. Um, so that's my issue, is that if even me as a kind of lifelong Democrat, I've gotten sick of a lot of the posturing on the left and a lot of what seems like greater concern for virtue signaling and terminology and so forth, as opposed to the sort of the pragmatic rubber meets the road issues. Even I've gotten tired of that. And I've been a loyal Democrat my whole life. Um, and I'm not the only one. And so that's part of the problem. And by the way, I'm going to be fine. My kids are going to be fine. They're doing well. They have a ton of support. They're going to be fine. I'm more concerned about kind of what the future holds. And if we don't address some of these inequities and educational outcomes, we're going to have problems socially. I mean, it's an increasing percentage of underemployed men or unemployed men, or an increasing percentage of men that don't see reasonable prospects for upward mobility. Those are ingredients for a very dangerous social context. So we have to address that. And sometimes I'm more optimistic about it, sometimes I'm less optimistic about it, but I have to tell you, I'm years into this effort, pivoting from the work I used to do. And I still find myself in situations where I first have to convince the room that there's actually a problem with men's mental health, with their academic outcomes, and so forth. And so I think there's more awareness, but there's not a lot of awareness yet. And I find like I'm using a lot of energy to still identify and characterize the nature of the problem to people,
Would you
even
say
people that
that,
are, you know,
I'm sorry to interrupt, would it be fair to say that you sense a general mood, especially amongst Democrats, that men don't need help, they need correcting,
yes,
or they need punishing?
100%. Yeah. And I'll be, uh, frank and say sometimes I've even heard um, women say, well, you're getting your due now. Like we had to suffer for generations, and now the wheel has turned. You know? The problem with that attitude is that, well, we see what the problem is that you can't isolate that chunk of the population and not have bad effects for everyone. Um, you can't just, wall off a part of the world and expect everyone else to play along. Um, and that again, it's sometimes hard to navigate these conversations because there are a lot of landmines in these conversations because I'm I've spent my whole career actually well before I kind of pivoted to this stuff working on equity gaps, working, focusing on historically underrepresented populations and trying to figure out, support systems, interventions to promote success, academic success for everyone. I don't think anyone can look at the history of my work, for example, and argue otherwise. So I sometimes have to point that out too. And actually, this reminds me, I think it's also super, super important to point out that whatever struggles we have among boys and men in general, the challenges that African American Black boys and men face and Latino boys and men face are much higher. So, that if you look at who's the most challenged academically, and you can go all the way back into K-12 education, it's Latino and African American boys. And it may not be a coincidence, well, it certainly isn't, that once again, President-elect Trump increased the percentage of Latino male and Black male voters. You know, uh, so that's the other issue is that even within, there's intersectionalities here and within
Before
the
we go on,
population.
I know that we're going to talk a lot about academics and economics has to play into that as well. But can you expand a bit on what you started to talk about in terms of if we cancel or wall off and or write off men with problems, underachievers? They're not just a few. That's a big amount. And so, what are the dangers of doing that?
Well, the dangers are, of course, that as these groups become more aggrieved, um, more hopeless feeling, then the willingness to engage in extreme remedies is only going to increase, right? Desperation has a way of bringing in options that you would never consider before, right? If I had to feed my family, I mean, if it really came down to having to feed my family, I would not hesitate to steal food, as an example. Under normal circumstances, I would never consider stealing anything. But if you ramp up the desperation enough, I'm suddenly willing to do a lot of things, not just for my own good, but that for my family, right? And that's the issue. If the level of frustration, hopelessness, desperation keeps increasing, then the possibilities for extreme behavior also go up. And this is not a mystery. I mean, we know this is how it works. We know it from social science. We know it from other things. We know it from history. So that's the concern is that if these things continue, then what we've seen so far is nothing compared to what's possible. I like to believe that America has very strong institutions that produce guardrails, but history shows us there's no form of government that is permanent necessarily, whatever it is, whether it's a democracy or otherwise, there's no guarantee.
Yeah.
So this is the long-term
Let
play
me just jump
and
in,
concern.
and you'll recognize that. I mean, I recognize what you say has real potential. And I also recognize that a lot of people on the left will listen to this and say, ah, he's threatening us. Uh, and that sounds like an implied threat. And we
Yeah.
were right about them all along. And this coming from a leftist professor.
Yes.
And just if you would like to finish out that thought.
Sure. What else? I'm not endorsing violence or criminality or anything. Certainly, it'd be silly for me to do that. What I'm telling you is what happens. What happens based on what we know has happened in the past. And from if you're looking at a movement and you disagree with that movement, of course you're going to see any action by that movement is problematic. But if you're within the movement and you legitimately believe that you have to engage in extreme behaviors in order to save yourself, let's say, and the yourself can be your group, whatever. Certainly, if we look at social movements, if we look at political movements, if we look at civil rights movements, the aspect of violence, of extreme behavior, even if from within the movement and the time it seemed justified, those things are real. And therefore we can't be shocked if it happens. It doesn't mean we're endorsing it. But I think what it does mean is it should light a fire underneath us to act now, to do something about that now. Unless we're just saying that we're willing to sacrifice these generations of men to whatever happens to them and we don't care. If we do care about people, though, or if we care about inequities wherever we find them, and
And
I think that would
families.
be, and families, which I think is the moral position, right? We can't just pick and choose which inequities we want to address. I think that's a position you can't maintain with any integrity. So if we're going to deal with inequities wherever we see them, and we believe that they're inequities, that they're systematic, that they cut across populations, that they're chronic, and all of those are characteristic of the gender gap, for example, in academic outcomes, then we need to address it. Or else the things we used to say on the left regarding wanting to lift as many people as possible, wanting to address, issues of access and inaccess and inequities, then those words ring hollow. Just because why? Just because it's a population that we haven't identified in the past as marginalized. That gets harder and harder to do when I can show you data going all the way back to the 1980s that boys and young men are getting left behind academically.
I've got a Pew Research paper in front of me from October of 2024, pointing
Very
out,
recent.
unsurprisingly, that fewer men are in college, especially four-year colleges. It's almost cut in half from the mid 90s.
Yes. And it doesn't matter where you look on the kind of, panoply of academic outcomes, you're going to find these inequities. Increasingly in areas where we used to think there was tremendous male advantage, like, for example, in some of the sciences, for example. And
STEM
and
epidemic.
yeah, I mean, are there still more male engineers and computer science majors and the like? Yes. But trust me, that's going to change too if current trends continue, and that's fine. But let's not kid ourselves and say that there aren't broad-based inequities in academic outcomes just because we can identify a couple of disciplines or majors where men still hold a majority. In the biological sciences, more women get degrees. Increasingly, more master's level and doctoral level students are women. In most fields, in fact, they're majority women. Um, Fewer men, even apply to college. Fewer men get into college. Fewer men graduate from college. it's at every point where you can see these off ramps to academic progression. And again, it's not to say that somehow that means that we have to put our thumb on the scale of women's success. But if increasingly every university you look at is going 60-40, 65-35% female male, that's a problem. That's a problem when in any modern economy, the best jobs require college degrees. That's a, and when I say require, sometimes it's not clear they actually require, but employers sure as hell privilege a college diploma over an applicant who doesn't have one for a job. Even if you look at the job and you're wondering what exactly was the necessity of a college diploma, you know,
In
but there
fairness,
it is.
if there were a third window in this uh, chat and it were a feminist academic who might say, yes, but that's the way it was for decades. We know what you're saying because we were in that boat. We couldn't even get into
Yes.
college.
Yes.
And
And the
and
and the
you
reasons,
had the thumb on the scale for the men all that time. And what you're saying is that, okay, but that doesn't make it right to do the same thing again.
exactly. And in fact, I take it even a little bit further. I would say that the reason that women's success academically was suppressed is because it was being actively suppressed. And once that lifted, in general, it has, at least based on the outcomes, it seems to have been lifted. Then what you're seeing is a kind of almost natural level of success for women and girls, even academically. You go all the way back to second grade, you start seeing these divergences because so much of what schooling is, especially in the early years, in fact, plays to women's strengths because of the way we socialize girls, right? To be more self regulated, to pay attention, to be adult oriented, to follow rules. We socialize girls that way. And that has tremendous benefits academically because those are the things that you often need to be able to do in the early years to succeed academically.
You've done a brilliant job of giving us the situation as it is. How should it be? How can it be? And how?
Do you mean how do we intervene
I
or what
can
do we
an
change?
intervention. If it's so dangerous, and I have no reason to doubt what you say,
Well, there's
and
been
I
a
hate
lot
to
of
use the
ideas.
word fix because I think that's so
Yeah,
simplistic. Because it has to
it
be a
is. Yeah,
process. Where do we start
yeah.
that process? Do you start it? Do we give up on this generation and start with the 2-year-old men or boys, or is it, or can you work on multiple fronts? And if so, how do you do it?
I think multiple fronts for sure. Um, I don't think we can afford to just cast away a certain group and say, sorry, it's too late for you. Well, we're going to work on the younger ones now. Um, so here's where the certainty with which I speak um, is going to start going away a little bit because fundamentally, we still don't fully understand the reasons for this divergence academically. I think we have some good ideas, but because this wasn't identified as a real issue, or I should say, we knew it was an issue decades ago, but there hasn't been the sort of traction to do something about it until pretty recently. The basic research to try to figure out what the sources are is still largely pending. It's a phenomena where we know what's happening, but we're not entirely sure why it's happening. I mentioned some things earlier on. I talked about how part of it is this kind of indeterminacy in the role of boys and men in modern America, and I think they feel that. I think even young boys, when they can't necessarily articulate these ideas, feel it. Um, I talk to young men all the time in college settings, and when the conversations get political, they often just close in on themselves and don't want to engage. And it's very noticeable, you know. And so when I talk to these men, these young men, 18, 19-year olds, when I talk to my sons, one of my boys is in high school, one just started his freshman year at college. When I talk to them, and I ask them about their friends, one thing you hear very clearly is that they're afraid to engage in these discussions because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing and then getting shut down by the teacher, shut down by classmates. And so they look at the cost benefit analysis and they decide it's better just to shut up, and not articulate their position or their concerns. So that's part of it. But the other part of it is we have to look at whether the basic things that we identify as problematic behaviors academically, especially in the early years, whether boys get over disciplined and over corrected early on, and whether they get identified as problems very early on
By
because
early
of
on, you
things.
mean what kind of age?
I mean second grade, certainly by third grade, and potentially even earlier, is that we often see a lot of what I would call normal boy behavior being labeled as problem behavior. You know, we know just based on the biology of the self-regulation maturation of boys that they're going to have a harder time focusing for long periods of time or sitting still in class in first grade or second grade. We know this. We know the biology behind this. But when boys sort of are constantly doing this, standing up, kind of showing evidence of their inability to really self-regulate, right? Which for them is normative. This is not a problem. It's just where they are developmentally. Teachers come down hard on that. The boys are so much more likely, and people have studied this. Boys are so much more likely to get negative attention from teachers than girls are. Um, and when this begins early, it creates trajectories, right? And increasingly, school starts to feel like a punishing experience for young boys.
So they get either
And
withdrawn, they either withdraw or they get aggressive.
they
Res-
withdraw, they get aggressive because they don't know what to do with their frustration in a healthy way, right? Um, and when boys have adequate supports around them, when people can sort of identify that and step in, if they're lucky to get a particular adult who particularly cares beyond parents, a lot of that stuff gets rectified. You know, um, there's a reason why if you look at, you know, elite, very rigorous high schools, for example, um, typically private high schools, fortunate or unfortunately, the gender gap is either small or non-existent because those kids get a lot of attention, a kind of attention and care and resources that often boys in public schools, low income neighborhoods are not going to get. Um, or they're not going to have parents, who have the time and understanding themselves when to intervene and when, by the way, to advocate for their sons. My boys are probably sometimes feel very unlucky that their father has a PhD in child development because, it didn't take much for me to reach out to teachers or reach out to administration if I thought that somebody wasn't handling something well, but also to take accountability and say, if my son is acting out in this way, I will also address it. We'll be partners in this together, but please keep me informed of what's going on. I'm lucky to be able to do that. But often parents, are don't have the time or the bandwidth to do that. Or
the
they're
training or background.
or the training, or even it's maybe even a kind of thing where they say, well, the teachers are the experts, the school are the experts. Who am I to intervene and tell them how to, educate my son, or to complain about something? A lot of people don't feel that they have the position to complain from. So all of that starts early, and I think, and then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once you feel that school is not for you, you start to act in ways that make that very true. There's some great research, from sociologists looking at African American males, and the fact that once they start feeling like the game is rigged in school against them, that's when they start to engage in more what we call oppositional behaviors. You know, Once they feel that it doesn't matter what they do in this school environment, they're not going to get a fair break. Then what do you expect them to do? They're not going to just, then happily comply with all of that. A lot of them are going to directly oppose that. And then that creates a cycle. In the same way that, when you look at aggression sometimes aggression in boys starts as a cognitive issue. It starts with misidentifying certain social cues and judging. For example, they're walking down the hallway, someone bumps into them. Maybe most people would think that's accidental. But for whatever reasons, you identify that behavior as intentional, then you're more likely to be aggressive back, right? Someone bumps into you, you push them. It starts as a kind of cognitive appraisal before it becomes emotional and the like. And again, once you start to feel that the authority figures in school are against you or don't understand you, you don't see the utility of doing well, or you don't see how you could do well, even,
This,
then you're not going
the way what strikes just occurred to me as you said that is there doesn't seem to be any coaching for boys. I'm not talking just about academic athletic programs. In athletics, you've got coaches that boys look up to, and it's not just what they do on the pitch, but how they handle themselves. And there seems to be perhaps a vacuum there. There and other places that you've mentioned within the academic system and how to
I
treat
couldn't agree more.
and
I
the
couldn't agree more.
and I know you have a lot of bases to cover here, but before we go on, it's a pretty dark picture. I'm not disputing what it is, but do you see any prospect that the state-funded school systems are going to come up with that kind of more enlightened teaching methods? And obviously, it plays into money and staffing issues and so forth. So I have to ask, I mean, Democrats traditionally and typically are more inclined to spend public funds on education. Hasn't worked for men, from what we've been discussing, and at least in that area. Do you see anything that says a new Republican administration and Congress will tend to do any more based on what
Probably, yeah,
anybody said so far?
yeah, maybe, but it's going to come about in ways that aren't going to be satisfying to the left, probably. One possibility is that the appetite for school vouchers, so that essentially parents keep their tax dollars that would normally go for public education and instead get a voucher to be able to choose, right? School choice issues, right? Which has very often been a kind of Republican idea. People on the left see it as a way of starving public education, right? But the question you have to ask,
A form perhaps of resegregation.
a form of resegregation. But here's what I sometimes, because I like also playing devil's advocate with my friends and colleagues. I ask them, why do you think that in many low income communities, in many predominantly underrepresented communities where Latino, Latina, African American families reside, right? School vouchers are actually quite popular. Why is that? That's because these are parents who feel that public schools can't do what they want them to do for their kids. And you can see the polling on this. It's very interesting. It's not this kind of clear black and white separation between Republicans and Democrats. It often breaks on class lines. And, you know, again, sometimes this kind of disingenuous argument from the left. I have friends who are affluent families and they love promoting public education and they love talking about how we need to put more money into public education. None of their kids are in public schools. None. And you have to actually, well, why not? And the argument get, well, they're not there yet. If public schools were better and I want to make them better. But we've been saying that for 70 years. So part of it is if you can't solve a problem, then people are going to look for other options. And so I think in the short term, the kind of training you would have to do among early education teachers at the scale you would have to do it on to really move the needle nationally on boys' outcomes, I think in the immediate future is beyond us. I don't think it's going to happen. If the problem gets so bad, maybe. I mean, sometimes nothing motivates more than crisis, but I think we've been in this crisis for a while. So I don't know. I'm not massively optimistic that we're going to make huge changes in the immediate future. But what might happen is that people are going to try different things. The whole idea of this very decentralized system of schooling we have in America, where it's very local based. And really, there's not a lot of federal control over education. People like to make a boogeyman out of the Department of Education at the federal level, but their power in terms of early education is pretty minimal compared to most other wealthy industrialized countries, where there's much more federalized, centralized control over education. We love the local model here. Well, one idea of the local model was that different districts are going to try different things. This is also the argument for the expansion of charter schools, right? Publicly funded schools that have more power over what they do and how they spend their money, that we're going to find things that might work. That's possible. I mean, you can certainly identify some schools that are doing a better job than others when it comes to the gender gap. But again, typically these are very well resourced schools.
Sounds like pretty
Either,
much on the it sounds like they're on the fringes now compared to what you outlined as what's necessary, which is a
yes,
broad-based approach that takes into account what you've outlined quite extensively in terms of how to, not only to treat boys, but to treat women and behavior and so forth, keep them interested, keep them in the educational tent, enthusiastic. And you need more people who can do that. You've got to train them. They have to go to college to get that training. And it just seems to be, I don't want to say hopeless circle, but it doesn't seem encouraging.
doesn't seem encouraging. You're right. I'm not going to say otherwise. And the other problem you have is a kind of cultural problem, or problem is the wrong word, a cultural difference in the perceptions of the utility of a college education. That has become a political issue as well, right? Um, Folks on the left who are in higher ed feel that the right is constantly attacking the higher education, of course. Um, and this goes beyond and was an issue way before the rise in anti-Semitism and the campus protests that led to all the focus on Ivy League schools. It goes beyond. It was happening before that. This kind of divergence, and again, the problem is that there is a reality behind the sense that a college education is useful for some groups, because here's what you find. If you take just men, for example, in college, men take not only do they you know uh, not only are they less likely to graduate, even once they're admitted and they matriculate, but they also take longer to graduate. And if you look at it from just a cost benefit analysis, what you find is that there is some truth that if you're accruing debt because you're not graduating in 4 or 5 or 6 years, or worse yet, you go to college for several years, accrue that debt, and then drop out, you don't even get a degree, then absolutely higher ed was less useful for you, you know. So there's some truth behind that. And the other issue is that, you know, there's a suspicion, I think, on the right that one of the reasons why Democrats are constantly kind of, you know, promoting college education is that because college education produces Democrats, right? That higher ed is also this place that socializes people in such a way that they're more likely to espouse
It
democratic with a
wasn't
capital D.
always that way.
It
Working
was
class
not always
people
that
used to
way.
be the absolute pure Democratic base.
And now, I mean, look, what's true? Here's what's true. Um, in higher education, among the professorate, and certainly among the kind of academic affairs, student support side of things, you'd be hard pressed to find a a significant percentage of Republicans. I mean, it's true. This is not saying something that isn't just factually true based on every survey that's ever been done in the last 20 years. If you go further back, it's a little bit different. But what seems to be happening is that clearly higher education has politically, in terms of at least the people employed there, taken a very leftward, trajectory. All right. Well, then if you're a Republican, you have to ask yourself, you have to give me a really good case to spend the money to send my kid there if I think that really what this is all about is just a kind of identity conformity, an ideological system, right? And that also means that very often you're not going to get the kind of parental engagement and actions that are going to promote that as a trajectory, as a pathway. And then you get further divergence, right?
I'm
And I don't,
talking. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah. And so the other thing I try to say is that even though I'm in higher ed and I'm constantly promoting the benefits of higher education, because I often just see these benefits as very pragmatic, right? Jobs, salary, etc. It's not for everybody. And the other problem we have is that for young men that don't want to go into higher ed, their other options are rather limited. We have we have some technical schools, we have certain vocational training, but compared to a lot of other countries, much more limited. So it's sort of like if you want a good paying job, this is what you have to do.
I,
And that I think is also a challenge.
I want to talk about the non-educated adult male in a moment, but before, can you just summarize where we've come so far in this discussion in terms of what, if anything significant, we might see done uh, for a child who's 5 years old today?
So I think if the awareness of this gender gap in academic outcomes hits a certain point, I'd like to believe that as an educator, if I was a teacher in a first, second, third grade classroom, just by being aware of this, that might change my pedagogical approach, even in subtle, small ways. We know that simply being aware of an issue can motivate behavioral change. So even if we're not necessarily training these teachers up in particular kinds of professional development that we think would be effective in addressing the gender gap, simply being aware of it might, for example, give a teacher a bit of pause before they lay down some discipline or send the kid to the office or start thinking of, oh, that's the problem kid because he's a boy and boys are problems, right? So maybe some of that. But I think beyond that, you mentioned something earlier about coaching. And I would broaden that a bit to talk about just how effective adult mentors can be that are beyond the parents. And this is something that, you might be familiar with him, Richard Reeves, who wrote Of Boys and Men, the book, and, in some ways launched a lot of this national discussion in the US on these issues. I think he's still a senior fellow at Brookings. And he talks about how it's a kind of a chicken and egg thing. Part of the reason why we can't identify as many mentors for boys starts with the fact that in early education, there are almost no male instructors. It's become a completely female dominated occupation.
Wow. Wow.
So, I don't know how it is in, I don't know actually the data in other countries, but in the US, Richard, I think in his book, threw out this kind of crazy statistic. And I may not be 100% right on this, so we should check it. But I think he said at some point that there's a higher percentage of female fighter pilots than there are male preschool teachers in this country. Um, and even if that's a little bit off, and maybe he said, kindergarten teachers, I can't remember, it still is the imbalance is off the charts. And by the way, that continues. And you see some increase in male teachers when you get to high school, junior high, high school. But generally speaking, a boy is going to see a lot fewer male teachers than they are female teachers.
Let me just ask a really radically stupid question.
No,
Is it absolutely necessary to spend 4 years in college to be taught how to teach a 6 or 7 year old kid in school? In other words,
it's a good question.
could you find that resource within non-college educated adults?
You could, but the way we have it structured in public education in particular is that if you want to teach in early ed, you, like in California, for example, and if you want to make a livable wage, and some would argue not even a livable wage, and for example, in California, my home state, you have to have a bachelor's degree in something like child development or liberal studies or something. Now, if you want to teach in upper grade levels, you also have to get credentials and either multiple subject or single subject credentials, and it goes on. But yeah, we've created a situation where you more or less do have to get a college degree. Your question is, should that be the case? I think in a lot of ways, focused child developmental training short of a college degree would be more than adequate.
Well, I
But
say
we're
this,
not, that's not,
but
yeah, that's not going to happen though.
let me expand
Yeah.
on my exclamation slash question. You've got people, probably mostly females, and I may be wrong about this, who look after very small children
Yeah.
in daycare centers everywhere around America who probably don't have much training at all.
Yes.
And that's a very developmental stage. Why can't you have a intensive vocational training that pays a decent wage, if it will make a difference in the lives of young pupils to get them on the road to a much better life, as opposed to making I don't know how much debt a college person, a graduate now accrues, but it wouldn't be anywhere near what a
Yeah.
vocational training, say 2 year training or 1 year training to do small specific jobs under
Yeah.
supervision. I mean, this is coming off the top of my head, and I'm just a
No,
layperson.
Mike, I think that I don't disagree with you. But I just don't see it happening because what you've seen is that what you've seen happen is more like this. In order to get better pay, for example, think about Head Start programs, which are in many ways child care for low income families, but that also has an educational component. It's supposed to be high quality, right? The way to get folks better pay is to keep increasing the credentialing of those people. And until you break that and say we can't just keep saying, well, now you need this and now you need a college degree because if you have a college degree, then we'll pay you more, right? That's the thing that keeps driving this inflation in the value of a college degree. Is the fact that that's where the pay is. That's how people decide on pay. Even in public schools, high schools, one way for teachers to make more money is to go back and get their master's degree. And then they get a bump that way, right? So the incentive structure is such that it keeps driving towards more and more credentialing, more and more certification, more and more higher ed. And by the way, higher ed benefits from that. It's butts and seats, for them. Yeah. And so breaking that is going to be really hard, and we require some investment as well. But I agree. I mean, look, it's such a hard thing to break. And the reason I know this is true is because if you look back at kind of peak unemployment, right, in the US, where wages were finally starting to go up across the board, and we had an unemployment rate, it's well below 4%. Employers were desperate to hire. You heard all the situations about people, just jumping from one job to the next because each next job offered them more money at a different company. You started hearing companies talking about, well, maybe we shouldn't require a college degree for this position. And that would open up the number of applicants, right? Because right now we're asking for a college degree. We can't even figure out exactly why we're asking for a college degree. There was a lot of talk about that. That went nowhere. If you look at the data during that period of time, once again, the pay differential for the same job between someone with a college degree and someone without one was big. So part of it is we've just created this incentive structure where people, maybe they want to believe in the value of a degree, that it does confer something in terms of human capability. But I think
I'm
it
going to play
also,
the devil's advocate. I'm going to dig my
yeah,
heels in for a minute.
dig
Uh,
them in, dig them in.
uh, I'm thinking in terms of people who have what they feel are dead-end jobs. Maybe they get a little more money, but I'm wondering, I'm going back to this thought about coaches that keep young boys and girls interested in school, understand their problems. If they start to get out of hand, they have somebody to look up to. Um, and if I were sending a child to a public school, I would and had two to choose from. One that had teachers plus uh, teaching, as you call them, teacher assistants or mentors or whatever, that had a lower level of training, but the right kind of training to address the problems that you've brought up. I'd be more inclined to send them there to a school that didn't have it. And and you could probably find plenty of people to fill those jobs, even though they aren't college graduate pay scales, because they're they can bright people, they're bright people. A lot of unemployed people, uneducated people are very bright.
Yeah.
It's not a matter of intelligence, is it?
No, it's often just a matter of opportunity. And the biggest predictor of whether you're going to go to college is if your parents went to college. Um, and so, absolutely. I just, I want to both agree with you, but also just say, I don't think it's going to happen though, because I just don't see, at least right now, I don't see, without a big infusion of resources, I don't see the incentive structure there. Um, and the power of coaching and mentoring is huge. And in fact, I'm a big advocate of sports because I think it does create this usually very healthy space for boys to be boys in a way that still creates structure and accountability and role modeling and also kind of another thing we can address is social isolation. Boys and men are more likely to be socially isolated. It breaks that too. But I
And
think it's
and for
part,
girls, it creates a confidence level, and we've seen that
of
already.
course, and we see that. And
Hugely
listen, this is
important.
the yeah, and this is the one of the big benefits of Title IX in federal legislation. Opening up more opportunities for girls to engage in sports, and it's been great. No, again, we can say that there's an inequity without saying that we have to take something away from girls. Um, and then just the mentoring. I mean, if we look at, for example, higher education, if I can just jump to higher education for a while, some of the most effective intervention support programs in promoting academic success are peer mentoring programs. And we don't do enough of that. You know, Connecting upperclassmen with underclassmen, with younger, incoming students, and creating that kind of collective support. We don't do that for boys by and large. And even when we create, I mean, I can give you a personal example. I helped create a pretty robust peer mentoring program at my university about 10 years ago. And although that program was open to everybody, it's 85% of the students taking advantage of it were female. And so part of it is we also don't work on promoting these kinds of student interventions with boys and young men. Even when they exist, they're often not partaking. Because again, this is a kind of through line. They don't feel as engaged in their academic settings. Even the ones that get through often kind of get through with, blinders on. They just want to get through it. They don't feel this connection that often drives help seeking behaviors, often drives their participation in things that can be helpful. You go back to early education, I think if we had more male teachers, if we had more, like you said, people that would have the role of mentor, right? But I don't know how we do that in the current climate and at the current level of resources. I would be very open to seeing different states or districts experiment with these approaches and see what works. People have tried different things, but often what happens is someone like me gets a big grant. They go into a particular school or school district. They run an intervention until the grant money runs out, and then they leave. And that's it. We collect our data, we see something works, but then it has no uh, sort of continuation. Um, I see that all the time. That's actually an endemic problem in educational research. So that's the problem I have is that or the concern I have is that what you're proposing, I think could work, but where's it going to happen? And where is it going to happen at scale? You know, I, I'm not optimistic about it. And so I don't, part of it is we're trying to kind of chip away a little bit here and there, and just trying to get the message out. And hopefully that spurs something. But my concern is I think things are going to have to get worse before a critical mass of people really push for national change.
What can be done for, and I'm not talking about handouts, but what hope is there for a better life, a better future, less resentment toward the system, less anger, etc., that we see and which you have described early on in this campaign process among non-college educated males who feel left behind economically. I don't know if they really think about education, but they can't all turn into AI experts. What
Yeah.
can be done?
Yeah.
And,
Well, I
and
think
well,
this,
I mean, that was the early thing. Well,
yeah,
sure, we're having an AI revolution. Just learn to use it, and you'll be fine.
yeah. Everybody has to be a computer science major or engineer. Yeah. Um, I think the first step is an honest, good faith offer to hear from them, hear from young men who feel left behind, ask them what we can do for them. A lot of it, oftentimes, we're not even having these conversations with these men themselves. We sit off to the side as economists and political scientists and education experts, and we're constantly saying, "Well, this is what you need. This is what you need. This is what you need." There's often not a lot of conversation directly with these men, and sometimes it's hard to get those conversations because a lot of these young men are inherently suspicious, and rightfully so, about whether we really care. And so you have to work at it. So part of it
Sorry,
is
did
just
you say on
hearing
campus? I miss it. Did you say
anywhere, anywhere.
anywhere? Well,
Yeah,
and
anywhere. We
before
don't have these conversations. Yeah.
before you continue, I just want to say that I did not ask the question in the context of trying to win them over for any party's votes,
Yes,
but
I agree. I agree.
for I think we are agreed on that. But
Yeah,
there
100%.
because there is a national interest for everyone that
Yes.
these men um, something good happens for them, or we show them a path where they can make it happen. And I don't know what
Yes.
it is.
Yeah, I agree. And you're right. It's important to point that out. There's both a self-interest in the fact that I believe we would have a healthier, more stable, more productive society if we engage more young men who feel disengaged and feel left behind. And I also 100% agree that part of it is also it's the right thing to do if we care about human beings and we care about human beings, right? Uh, but I'll go back. I think part of it is oftentimes folks like me are not directly engaging with these young men. I try to, but other academics, other scholars, political scientists, pollsters, leaders of either party, whatever it is, people in the community leaders, we don't engage with them because I think, like you said earlier, part of the feeling is um, part of the part of the problem is it is politicized, and so what do I gain if I'm from one political party? What do I gain in reaching out to someone who may be suffering, but I feel is ideologically a different party? It becomes this game of, like you said earlier, I'm trying to bring them into my fold as opposed to thinking about what's best for them.
And conversely, if you are someone who benefits from that resentment as a politician, you may
Yes,
not want to change them either.
exactly. And I understand the arguments from both sides of it, where because this is a competition, right? Political parties compete for voters. It it skews the approaches to this idea that it's we have to win. And I get it. Political parties want to win elections, and so they'll often do or say whatever they have to. But from the perspective of how do we actually make outcomes better for folks, we start by listening. The second issue is we have to take the criticisms of our educational system seriously from within the educational system. So right now, the other problem I see often in higher ed, but I see it in other places as well, is that when we get survey results back and we see this very clear downward trend in trust people have in education, right? It's the highest for higher ed, but there's a lot of dissatisfaction with high schools, et cetera. The argument, the reflexive argument I hear is very defensive. What I hear is, well, we just have to communicate better to parents. They don't understand what the benefits are. They don't understand what we really do here. They are getting a mixed view of what we do. All of this very defensive instead of saying, are we sure we're holding up to our mission as an educational institution? So that kind of real self-reflection also has to happen. And everything should be put on the table. We should fundamentally look at what is the purpose of education? What is the purpose of high school? What is the purpose of college? Is this the only pathway to a better life? If not, then how do we improve other pathways to lead to livable wage jobs? So that's the other thing we have to do. And then finally, I think we have to think about what are the not the incentive structures, what kinds of behaviors do we feel are normative versus problematic in early education? And are we consistently and chronically misattributing normal boy behavior as being antisocial and problematic? I think that happens quite a bit, and we end up over punishing it, and we end up diagnosing it all the time, and we end up doing things that make the problems worse. So there has to be a kind of realignment in our understanding of what normative behavior is and how we respond to it. Um, there's so much good research, for example, on how educators are often more punitive to African American students, right? Good research on that. There's trainings about that. There's trainings about how to overcome those kinds of biases pedagogically. Oh, there's an infrastructure there for addressing that. Have we made as much progress as we should have? No. I think, African American boys and girls still get punished more, but it's a recognized problem. People are trying solutions. That is not happening on the gender gap. That's not happening for boys in particular as a group that is suffering from an inequity. So we know what the tools can be. I think we still have a lot to learn. Like I said, the amount of research identifying the root causes is still in its infancy. We need a lot more research. But that's the model I would borrow from. We have examples of trying to address inequities for other groups. There's probably a lot that generalizes to how we would address it for boys in general.
Finally, I want to bring it back to that group of men, a large number of Trump voters who are non-college educated, unhappy, resentful, feel that they've been left behind.
Yeah.
What's the message to them now?
Well, if I can say what the message shouldn't be, the message shouldn't be, oh, you don't understand what you did. Because I'm hearing that as well from Democrats, that essentially these are people not smart enough to vote in their own self-interest. If that's your leading message, you're not going to get these folks to listen to you at all. It's not about even converting, it's about just even engaging with these folks. So part of it that has to change. We have to get beyond this idea that we know what's right. I mean, this is my problem with orthodoxies in general. And clearly we have these orthodoxies on both the right and the left, but I'm sort of most familiar with the orthodoxies kind of on the left because that's where I sit, right? And I'm just inherently suspicious, and I don't like the bleeding edges of any movement or ideology. Because I think that whatever the truth is, the capital T, it's going to be somewhere in between, right? It's going to be somewhere inside of those extreme edges. And so I'm suspicious and skeptical, right? And part of the problem on the left is that we have the sense of, who the true believers are. And you have to be a true believer. And we have all these litmus tests. And the problem when you get a bunch of true believers together is that, they inevitably kind of coalesce into these kind of orthodoxies about what's right. And then that becomes a very blinkered view of the world. And it becomes immune to sort of self-reflection and self-criticism and dissent of any kind, right? And that's how a very vocal part of the left, it may not be the whole left, but it's often the most vocal part of the left. That's what's happened there. And there's a corollary on the Republican side as well, for sure. But I'm talking from within my own people here. That is inherently unwelcoming to people that disagree even with some of the propositions. That's the problem. And when people operate in these orthodoxies, they start believing that they're operating out of a moral and ethical certainty. So any product of that orthodoxy must therefore be good. And it kills the ability to self reflect. And I'm worried that's kind of where we're at in some places. I mean, now there's a lot of discussion because the left just got its butt handed to it in an election. And so maybe there's more willingness to be self critical. But I'm still hearing a lot of the reason we didn't get those voters is because they just don't understand. That's that's not going to go anywhere. I mean, so that's the other thing that has to change. There has to be a bit more humility on all sides, but certainly on the left, if we're going to re-engage with these folks and offer them and get them to even listen to proposals that could result in benefits to them. They're not even listening right now because we've put out this very unwelcoming, you know, um, projection that was brought in to the American Psychological Association's National Task Force on Boys in School, increasingly working with others nationally in this space, and kind of, trying to get the message out. That's why I love opportunities like this, but also starting to put together research agendas that are going to help us better identify the root causes of these gender gaps. Like I said, I think you heard a lot of them that I went through. I think we have some sense. Some of these seem like reasonable explanations, but very often when we do the actual research, we're surprised by what we actually find. And so I think that's the next big step. We have to do more research. Then we'll work from there to figure out what the best interventions would be.
What words would you have for someone who thinks they were about to train to be a primary school teacher?
I would say I would thank them first because it's a hard job that doesn't pay very well compared to the work that's being done. Um, so they'd first have my gratitude. I think the other thing I would say is advocate for where you see the challenges. Don't go in presuming you know which kids are going to struggle and which aren't. Look at what's happening. Be mindful of the data, of the real data, not our ideological frameworks that very much affect what we notice and don't notice, right? People have this natural, very self-confirming kind of biases, right? We notice the things that align with our worldviews, and we often ignore what don't. And everyone's guilty of these to some extent, but that's why we want data. So look at where you're working, look at the outcomes for the kids you're working with, and then advocate where you see inequities. Maybe you go to a school where there isn't a gender gap between boys and girls. Maybe that's not the challenge. Maybe it's another challenge at your school. But if you see that the issue is the way boys are being differentially treated versus girls, and you see that there are negative outcomes to that, then advocate, say something, talk to the leadership at the school, talk to other teachers, see what they're saying. But people have to step up, or else, and very often this is how things change at the grassroots, where the interface between the people dealing with boys and the structures are the most intimate. And then the other thing is, be mindful of the fact that it's very easy to misinterpret behaviors of young children. They're young children. You have to just think that whatever they're doing, the idea that there's this very strong malicious intent is probably wrong. You know, when people are older, yes, but with young kids, young boys, when they can't sit still, etc., don't take that personally. Don't think that this is because this very young boy is just trying to be a jerk on purpose. And sometimes I feel that's how people react. have a little bit of grace, have a little bit of tolerance there. Um, and that might help just that.